In this course, we're going to be learning how you can retouch for different skin tones. I'll teach you some of my favourite tools that I use in Photoshop and also some of my favourite methods too. Before we begin, it's important to consider whether a graphics tablet might be right for you. It's definitely something that will make the retouching process easier and something that I always use myself. For this first lesson, I'm going to be showing you how you can set up your Photoshop interface. Let's begin setting up your Photoshop interface for skin retouching. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about in regards to your interface is going to be the color space that you're working in, which is going to be Adobe RGB and sRGB. I personally prefer to work with Adobe RGB. This is primarily because Adobe RGB is a better color space for printing, and I always like to have that option of having a wider color space in case I do need to print my images at any time. I prefer working with Adobe RGB as my color space in Photoshop and then exporting to sRGB. sRGB is a color space that is used primarily for web, and that's what you would usually export your images as to optimize them for web. So to change your color settings at any time, you can go up to Edit and then go down to Color Settings. And you'll see up the top here where it says Working Spaces, under RGB, I have Adobe RGB 1998 selected. This is what I usually use when I'm retouching in Photoshop. As I said, I like to have this particular color space just in case I want to print any of my images in future. And I also like working with a wider range of colors, which is exactly what the Adobe RGB color space is. It is a wider range of colors accessible to your images. You can then click on this drop box to convert to sRGB at any time. But as I said, I like to do this at the end when I've finished retouching and I've saved a copy in Adobe RGB as well before I export. sRGB as a color space will contain a lot less colors, so you'll find that it's better optimized for the web instead. I also like to make sure that under profile mismatches here, that ask when opening is ticked. Now this is because sometimes I do forget when I'm opening some of my images in Photoshop. I might have converted something or converted the working space to sRGB at some point, and I haven't realized, and then I'm opening another image that I want to be Adobe RGB into an sRGB working space, if that makes sense. So we want to make sure that this is ticked. So Photoshop is going to basically ask us whenever we put an image into Photoshop about any profile mismatches, and then we can convert the color space if we need to, or keep it the same way. And then you would go and click OK. This is mainly all I would do for color settings in Photoshop when I'm skin retouching. The next part of the Photoshop interface that I really want to make you aware of is the brush settings tab. Now this might be over here on the right hand side. If it's not here by any chance, you can always go to Window and select brush settings to bring it up. Now when you've got your paintbrush selected, it's really important if you are using a graphics tablet to be aware of this particular tab, especially when it comes to using pen pressure. I tend to have transfer ticked a lot when I'm skin retouching, and I also go into opacity jitter and make sure that pen pressure is selected. This ensures that whenever I'm using my graphics tablet, that it's actually applying the pen pressure that I'm using on the graphics pad to my images. So it's basically just integrating that into Photoshop. This is definitely an important tab, so I always like to make people and students aware of this at the beginning. The next tab that I would recommend having in your workspace and Photoshop interface is the History tab. Now this might be up here once again. If it's not, you can always go to Window and click down to History to make it visible. The reason I love to have the History tab in my interface is because I quite often need to go back a few steps and need to undo a couple of steps that I might have made. This makes it really easy to do that, as all the steps are displayed in this section here. I also love using the snapshot function. Now you can find the snapshot function just here where there's the little camera. And what actually happens is if you make an adjustment, you can go back to the original photo, or you can kind of flick between snapshots as you go along in your process. So for example, if I was to add an adjustment layer here of curves, and we're just going to bring this line up. If I wanted to take a snapshot of this part of the image and part of the process, I would then click on the camera here, and I still have my original image just at the top here, so I can click on that and go back to the beginning, but I can also go back to where I was before quite easily. This is one of my favorite functions in Photoshop, and I definitely recommend using this if you can. The next tab that's very important for any type of retouching process is the Layers tab, and this is going to be the tab that you'll be working with most. So just over here down the bottom, you've got your layers tab, and you can move this between any of the other tabs here, depending on what your setup is and what you find most efficient. So layers will always contribute to non-destructive editing, and it's a really important process of skin retouching in particular. Most of the layers that I'll be using will be adjustment layers, which are found just here underneath this tab here. And these will apply adjustments to the image along with a layer mask attached to them. So like the curves adjustment layer that I just put on the image, you can see here, there's the adjustment and there's the layer mask. And you can actually find the properties tab up here for this adjustment, and this is where you would actually make the adjustments. The other type of layer that you can create is a blank transparent layer. So you could just click on this button here, the little plus, and you'll see that there's a completely transparent layer. You'll see that there's like a checkerboard in this box here, and that does mean that it is a transparent layer. You can also add layer masks to regular transparent layers, and the way to do this is to click on the layer mask function here. And you can see that it's added a mask to it, just like the adjustment layer below. We're going to get a little bit more into layer masks and adjustment layers though, so don't worry too much about them just yet. And then the last tab that I'm going to mention in the Photoshop interface setup is going to be the color tab, and this is what I like to have up in the top right hand corner. Quite often you'll find yourself during the retouching process needing to select certain colors of the skin tone or the image. And the way that you can do this a lot of the time is by holding down Option or Alt on the keyboard. And usually if you've got your paintbrush tool selected, you'll see a little eyedropper that will come up every time you hold down Alt or Option. You can then select certain parts of the skin tone for certain colors. So making sure our background layer is selected, and if I click here, you'll see that I've selected part of the skin tone and a color of the skin tone, and that will also show up in this top right hand corner as well. And you can alternatively move the cursor around this area or just up on the side here to select a color that you need to select. But that is basically all of the tabs that are most important for skin retouching, and mainly the tabs that you'll see quite regularly during these lessons. Now that you've set up your Photoshop interface, in the next lesson we're going to look at how you can process your raw files. In this lesson, we're going to look at how you can process your raw images in Camera Raw. Let's get into it. So before we delve into all of the information about RAW files, I'm actually going to open my RAW file first. So this is the file here that I'm going to open, and you can see that it's got an extension with cr2.cr2. Now this extension is a RAW file extension for a Canon camera. So if you shoot with a Canon camera or you are retouching an image that has been shot using a Canon camera, you will see the file extension .cr2. This will definitely change depending on the type of camera or the brand of camera that you use. So RAW file extensions will differ. If you're using a Nikon camera, for example, then you will see .nef as a RAW file extension. So like I said, depending on the image that you're working on personally, you will see a different file extension here from time to time, depending on the brand of camera. I'm going to double click on this file now, and we're going to open it into Camera Raw, which is a raw processing program that is attached to Adobe Photoshop. So you can see the image here has been brought into Camera Raw, which, as I said, is another program that is attached to Adobe Photoshop that processes raw images. It is specifically for that purpose. So before we make any adjustments, I'm going to quickly go through what a raw file is. So overall, raw files contain a lot more information and detail than a JPEG. A JPEG is virtually already processed in camera, and RAW files are the file of choice for professional photographers and retouchers. It allows you a lot more versatility when editing a photo, and RAW files are generally much larger sizes than JPEG due to these factors. But every time a JPEG is opened on a computer, the quality is lessened. So this is another reason why you should work with RAW files. RAW files are a lot more versatile and will hold more quality and detail, and most professional photographers will shoot in RAW. So in terms of how to process a RAW file, I've already briefly mentioned this, but you must process a RAW file using a separate RAW processing program, such as Camera Raw, integrated with Photoshop, as you can see here, or you can also use other programs such as Lightroom or Capture One. This will involve making several adjustments to the image before you go into the retouching process in Photoshop. It's really great to then have a PSD or TIFF image once processed with Camera Raw to ensure the file quality is lossless. So here I've purposefully chosen an underexposed image just to show you how powerful shooting in RAW can be and processing RAW images. So we're going to go up to our basic adjustments on the right here, and I'm going to make a few adjustments to this image just so it's prepared and ready to go into Photoshop and the exposure is correct and all of the tones are kind of correct or where they need to be. So first off, we definitely need to change the exposure on this. And this would be a lot more difficult to adjust on a JPEG image if it was taken like this and very underexposed. This is because JPEG files, as I said before, don't retain as much quality or detail, and when you push the exposure up, you would find the image would start to get quite grainy and the colors would really seem a little bit off. So with our RAW image here, we're going to just bump up the exposure quite a bit, just to around 1.75, and you can see just by moving that slider, how much power you really have with a RAW image to adjust the exposure. This is why I always like to shoot in RAW. I then also go down to the clarity, and I like to adjust this before the retouching process with portraits because it really helps any texture stand out on the skin tone. So I really like to just kind of sharpen up those details just a little bit, but not going too overboard with clarity because it can look too embossed and too sharp. And so if I keep moving that up, you can see what I mean. So we're going to keep it down to a nice low level. I also like bringing back some vibrance into images if I need to in Camera Raw. So looking at this particular image, it was backlit. So sometimes you do lose a bit of that vibrance and color when you have a backlit image. And sometimes the detail and texture can be lost in backlit images too. But for this image, I'm going to pump up the vibrance just a little bit, just to see a little bit more warmth back in the image. And one other thing that I like to do in Camera Raw before we get started, I also like to go down to the color mixer here. And this will show us our HSL, so our hue, saturation, and luminance in the image. One particular thing that I like to do here is just adjusting skin tones. So I find that most skin tones will be within the reds, oranges, and yellows. So I'm going to just adjust the oranges just a little bit. I think that there's a little bit of dullness just coming into the photo here from the lighting. So we're going to bring back a little bit more warmth into the skin tone just by moving the orange up a little bit. So you can see if I keep moving that up, it really makes the skin tone very warm, but we don't want that. We just want a little bit of warmth in there. Another slider that I'm going to move in particular in this image is going to be the green slider. So I'm just going to move that up just a little bit so some of the green stands out nicely in the image. And you can see there that it's really just picked up on those greens and saturated them just a little bit more. And then as an overall adjustment, I can also go down into color grading. And I wouldn't usually do my color grading at this particular step in Camera Raw, but I will just move the midtones just over to the yellow and orange section just to kind of give the image a little bit more warmth overall. As I said, backlit images do tend to remove some of that vibrance. Just making sure that we're not going too far with that. So you can make as many adjustments as you like in Camera Raw, but I tend to not go too far in this process. I just like to make sure that my exposure is looking a little bit better or where I like to have it, and that all of the basics are kind of covered. So in this particular photo, I probably wouldn't do much more in Camera Raw as I do have a lot of adjustments to make in Photoshop. So there are a few ways to open a RAW image into Photoshop from here. If you click Done down in the bottom right-hand corner, this will actually save an XMP file. So it kind of overwrites the RAW file itself. Having said that, the XMP file is kind of like a layer. So it sort of happens as an extra file, and then you've still got the RAW file intact, but you can open it at this stage from now on. What I like to do though, most of the time when I've finished anything in Camera Raw and I want to open it into Photoshop, is that I would just click open and it will open straight into Photoshop and I'll be ready for my retouching process. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm just going to click open And we've got our raw processed image ready for retouching. Now that we've processed our raw images, we can then look at how we can use a non-destructive workflow process in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at how you can create a non-destructive workflow process in Photoshop. So let's get into it. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about working with layers and groups, using adjustment layers, and using layer masks. All of these elements are really imperative when you're doing skin retouching. Working with layers are particularly important for non-destructive editing as they allow the editing process to be performed on top of the image in separate layers, ensuring that the original layer of the image is intact and untouched. Groups will also help to ensure that your layers are organised during the retouching process, and they essentially act as a folder. So we're going to go down to our Layer tab just down the bottom here, and you can see that you've got your Layers tab just here. Now looking at this background layer here, this is essentially the background of the image. This is the image itself, and we don't want to be doing any adjustments to the image directly. So any adjustments that are made directly onto this background layer will affect the original quality of the image. So what we're aiming to do in the retouching process is to work above this background layer. And working with layers and groups are the best way to do this and the most organised way to do this. So in terms of creating new layers, we briefly went over this in one of the previous lessons, but to create a new blank layer, you would just click this button here with the little plus. So you can see that the thumbnail has a little checkerboard in it, and this essentially means that it is a transparent layer. There is nothing on this particular layer until we either make an adjustment using one of the tools on the left-hand side. So for example, we can use the paintbrush tool to paint on this layer, and you can use the little eye to turn this on and off. Or you can delete the layer itself by clicking on this little button down here. So that's kind of what you would use a transparent layer to do. You can apply certain tools to that layer and certain parts of the image. I'm just going to delete this layer here though, so I'm going to drag this just into the rubbish bin, just in the right-hand corner. And now we're going to talk about adjustment layers. This is something I've also briefly gone over previously. But adjustment layers are similar to layers in that they work on top of the original image layer and are non-destructive. However, adjustment layers work more like adding effects across the whole image, such as brightness, contrast, curves, selective color, etc. And this is all without altering the original image. This way you can control the effects in a more specific way and lower the opacity, flow, and impact if needed later on. So to add an adjustment layer, you would go down to the adjustment layer panel just down here and click on this button here. You can see that there's a lot of different types of adjustment layers that do come up in this drop-down menu. And one in particular that we will probably use quite a bit in this course is going to be curves. So I've just added a curves adjustment layer. You can see it looks a little bit different to adding a new transparent layer. I'm just going to add another transparent layer just to show you the difference between the two. So this adjustment layer is essentially going to make an adjustment to the entire image at this point. So if we move this bar up in the curves box here, you can see that it's applying an adjustment to the whole layer itself and to the whole image. Now, for example, if I wanted to specifically put parts of this adjustment layer in certain parts of the image, I can utilize what's called a layer mask, which is already attached to an adjustment layer when you add it onto your image in Photoshop. So this white box here is called a layer mask, and you can utilize it in different ways. Working with masks is something that is commonly used throughout the retouching process. A mask acts as an addition to a layer. You can add a layer mask onto any layer by clicking the button at the bottom. So for example, if I went back to the transparent layer here, I can actually click on this box here, and that adds a mask just like the adjustment layer already has here. As I did mention before, masks can be used in terms of applying adjustments to a certain part of an image. So if we go back to our curves layer here, I'm just going to move this bar up even more just so it's easy to see when we make the adjustment. But you can see that it's applied it to the whole image. Say for example, I just want to apply it to a certain part of the image. I'm actually going to hold down Control-I on the keyboard. This would be Command-I on a Mac, and this actually inverts the mask. You have to make sure that the mask is selected for this to work. So you can see now the adjustment has actually gone and this particular box has turned black. Now how we can apply this to part of the image is by getting the brush tool, for example. And then you have to make sure that you've got white selected over here in the color box. And you can also change the color to white up here in the color tab as well. Once we paint onto the image, you'll see that the adjustment, the curves adjustment that we've made, is actually coming up onto a particular part of the image. So you're basically letting the adjustment that we've made with this adjustment layer here, curves, actually show through onto the image in certain parts. We're going to go a little bit more in depth with this during the lessons, and you will get to see how dodge and burn specifically as a retouching method is used via using adjustment layers and curves as well. We're now going to move on to setting up our workflow. So I'm just going to drag these layers down into the bin just in the right-hand corner again, and we're going to delete those. So for setting up our workflow, we're going to be doing this in a streamlined way, utilizing layers, adjustment layers, and folders. This workflow can change from image to image depending on the adjustments that need to be made, but I do tend to have a standard way of doing this, and we're just going to follow that particular workflow for now. So the way I would set up my workflow, as I said at the beginning of the lesson, is by using folders and layers. And this is just an easy way to do this at the beginning of your retouching process so you can make sure that you're ready to go and everything is very streamlined and neat. To add a group or a folder, you would click on this little folder icon down here. I like to make sure that I rename all of my layers and groups just so everything seems streamlined once again, and I'm going to double click on this to rename it. So our first group here that is going to be renamed is going to be called Healing. I'm then going to add a transparent layer underneath Healing. And then we're going to rename this layer Healing Tools. So this is going to be our first basis for skin retouching. This is where we're going to utilize our healing tools in Photoshop, and I'm going to move on to that in a future lesson. We're then going to create another group, and this one is going to be called Dodge and Burn. And then we're going to add a couple of adjustment layers underneath this heading. So to do this, we would click on this button down here and then go up to Curves. This is going to be our Dodge layer, so I'm going to rename this one right now to Dodge. And to create our Dodge layer with our Curves adjustment, we're going to move this particular line up so the image becomes really bright. I'm then going to hold down Control-I or Command-I on a Mac and making sure that the layer mask is selected to just invert that layer mask. I'm then going to go on to how you would do the Dodge and Burn method on a future lesson, but for now we're just going to set up our workflow like this, just so you can see a really good overview of how everything should look when it comes to a skin retouching workflow process. So now we've created our Dodge layer, I'm then going to create a Burn layer, which is going to be a really similar process to this one. So we're going to add another Curves adjustment layer. I'm then going to bring this line right down this time, so the image becomes dark. And making sure that the layer mask is selected, I'm once again going to hold down Control-I on the keyboard, and so it inverts it. Now double clicking on this particular layer, I'm going to rename it to Burn. So you can see by clicking on the arrows here, you can open up the group or the folder. So we're just going to close them for now, and we're going to create our next group. This particular group is going to be called Skin Color Correction. We're not going to add any layers to this particular group at this stage. And this is because it's going to really depend on the image as to what adjustment layers we really need to use and how we need to correct the skin tone. A couple of adjustment layers that I like to use when it comes to correcting skin color happens to be Curves and Selective Color and Vibrance. So just to give you an idea of the kind of adjustment layers we would use underneath this heading, I would likely use a Selective Color especially. But for now, we're just going to leave this as is, and you'll see a really good overview of our workflow. For the next group that we're going to create, I'm going to rename this one to skin texture. Then underneath this particular heading, we're going to add a blank layer. So this is going to be a transparent layer here. And I'm going to rename this one to Clone Stamp. So this particular layer is one that we're going to use with the Clone Stamp tool, and this is going to help really soften any skin texture that we come across that might be rough looking, and we're going to utilize this layer for that particular purpose. I would sometimes, if the skin texture is really rough and we really need to soften it even further, I would sometimes add another layer and rename this one to Paintbrush. So this would actually be to use the Paintbrush tool along with the Clone Stamp tool to really help soften any rough texture on the skin tone. But once again, this will depend on what kind of image you're working on and how it really will affect the image. And then for the last heading, I'm going to make another group, and we're going to rename this one to Skin Color Correction. And I'm actually not going to add any layers underneath this particular heading, only because with the adjustment layers that we would usually use under the heading of Skin Color Correction, it can vary. So a couple of skin color correction layers that I like to use when I'm editing photographs usually tends to be Selective Color, Curves, Vibrance. Those are a couple of my favorites. But as I said, it can depend on the image that you're working on as to what adjustment layers might be most suitable for that. So I'm going to open up all of the headings now, and you will see what our workflow looks like. And you can see that this is a very basic workflow to get you started with skin retouching. Sometimes I will also have another group above this that says finishing touches. Now, if I feel like there's anything that needs to be gone in and tweaked or altered at the end of editing an image, I usually put any adjustments that I make or any finishing adjustments into that particular group. But for now, this is the workflow process that we're going to go off. As I said, it's important to keep your workflow neat and tidy because it's very easy for it to get out of hand. So make sure that when you're doing your workflow process, that it does have a very streamlined element to it. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how we can approach retouching different skin tones. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to approach retouching different skin tones. Let's get straight into it. So you really need to approach retouching skin tones differently because of the sheer amount of tones and textures amongst the human race. No one person's skin is exactly the same, so we can't treat retouching all the same. Some people have more textured skin tones, some people have virtually no texture and minimal pores, and some people have blemish-prone skin or freckled skin tones. This is not even to mention the infinite colour range of skin tones as well. This is why we need to approach skin tones in a way that works on an image-by-image basis. Even different lighting situations can make a skin tone appear completely different. Just as you would use a different foundation base for a deeper skin tone model or a lighter skin tone model, you would use a slightly different way of retouching. There are infinite amounts of different coloured skin tones on this planet, so it's important to be aware of how they should appear throughout the retouching process. There are a few different techniques that we will be talking about with skin retouching, and the dodge and burn method we'll be using works consistently with light and shadow, so you can already imagine how this might apply to a skin tone spectrum, whether it be a lighter or deeper skin tone. Although we'll be using methods to counteract blemish-prone or very textured skin, we'll be learning how to use these methods in a way that ensures a natural effect. The end goal of all of these methods is to retain a natural effect. Remember this as a key point. Now that you know how to approach retouching different skin tones in Photoshop, in the next lesson we're going to learn how to utilize the healing tools in Photoshop.